first moved into the house, I remember thinking how perfect it was. A little cottage just outside town, surrounded by trees and far from the noise of the city. It was everything I had wanted. A quiet place for me and Clara to start our life together. The house had been vacant for a few years, but we got it at a great price. Our realtor mentioned it had been on the market for a while because the previous owners had disappeared under strange circumstances. But we didn't pay much attention to that. We were excited for our new beginning. The first few weeks were blissful. We painted the walls, filled the place with furniture, and made it our own. There was just one thing that bothered me: the cellar. It was a small wooden door hidden under a rug in the hallway. When we first found it, I tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. It seemed to be locked from the inside, or maybe it was rusted shut. Clara said we should just leave it. Probably nothing down there but spiders and junk, she said. But every time I passed by that door, I felt a strange pull, a curiosity I couldn't shake. Something about it seemed wrong. And then Friday the 13th rolled around. That was when everything changed. It started as a joke. That morning, Clara laughed and said, "You know, if you want to test your luck, you could try opening that cellar today. It is Friday the 13th after all." Her smile was playful, but I could tell she had been thinking about it too. There was something unsettling about having a door we couldn't open in our own house. So I grabbed my toolbox and headed over to the cellar door. The wood was old and warped, and after a few minutes of struggling with a crowbar, I managed to pry it open. A cold draft rushed out, carrying with it a smell of damp earth and something else, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I shone my flashlight down into the darkness, revealing a narrow staircase descending into the ground. The walls were made of rough stone, and the steps were covered in dust and cobwebs. There didn't seem to be anything down there, just more darkness at the bottom. "Looks like we found our creepy basement," I joked, but Clara didn't laugh. She stood behind me, her face pale. "Let's just close it up and forget about it," she said, but I couldn't resist. I started counting the steps as I made my way down, each one creaking under my weight. When I reached the bottom, something strange happened. There was a 13th step that shouldn't have been there. I stood at the bottom of the stairs, staring at the extra step beneath me. I knew I had counted correctly. There were supposed to be 12 steps. But here I was, standing on the 13th. The cellar itself was small, no bigger than a storage room, with a dirt floor and walls lined with old wooden beams. There were no windows, no lights, and aside from the musty smell of damp earth, the place felt suffocating. My flashlight flickered as I shone it around the room. That's when I noticed something odd. There was writing on the walls. Faint, barely visible beneath layers of dust, but there. I stepped closer and squinted to make it out. It wasn't in English. It wasn't in any language I recognized. Strange symbols and runes, all carved into the stone, spiraled around the room in an intricate pattern. Suddenly the air grew colder. I could see my breath in front of me, and the overwhelming sense of being watched crept over me. I turned quickly, expecting to see Clara at the top of the stairs, but she wasn't there. The cellar door was still wide open, yet somehow I felt trapped. A faint sound broke the silence, whispering. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but then it grew louder, filling the small space. The symbols on the walls seemed to pulse in the dim light, like they were coming alive. I turned to leave, but that's when I saw it. Something was moving in the shadows. I backed up quickly, my heart pounding in my chest. Something was down here with me. At first, I thought it might be an animal, but the way it moved, it wasn't natural. It was slow, deliberate, as if it was crawling toward me from the darkest corner of the cellar. I shone my flashlight in its direction, and for a split second I saw something. Pale skin, long fingers, and hollow eyes that reflected the light like a predator's. Then it was gone, retreating back into the shadows as if taunting me. I bolted up the stairs, taking them two at a time. When I reached the top, Clara was waiting for me, her face pale and worried. "What happened? You've been down there for over an hour," she exclaimed, but I knew I hadn't been down there that long. It felt like only minutes had passed. I slammed the cellar door shut and locked it, breathing hard. "There's something down there," I said, struggling to find the right words. Clara's eyes widened. What do you mean? Did you find something? I shook my head, too shaken to explain properly. That night, we tried to forget about the cellar, but as we sat in the living room, the sound of scratching came from beneath the floor. It was faint at first, like claws raking across wood. Then it grew louder, more frantic. Clara grabbed my arm. "Did you lock it?" she asked, her voice trembling. I nodded, but deep down, I knew it didn't matter. We didn't sleep that night. The scratching continued, relentless, until just before dawn. Then it stopped. For a few hours, there was only silence, but it was the kind of silence that presses down on you, making every creak of the house sound like something crawling closer. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, but Clara was convinced something had been let loose. She wanted to leave, but where could we go? This was our home. Around noon, I worked up the courage to check the cellar again. I grabbed a hammer, ready to nail the door shut if I had to. But when I pulled back the rug, the door was already wide open. The lock was broken, as if something had forced its way out. My heart raced as I peered down into the darkness. The 13th step was still there, but now it was stained, dark red, like something had bled onto it. I backed away, slamming the door shut once more, but it was too late. That night, the scratching returned, this time louder, accompanied by soft whispers echoing from the walls. Clara couldn't take it anymore. "We need to leave, now," she cried, but I was frozen with fear. The whispers grew louder, coming from every direction until they were deafening. The house itself seemed to shudder as the thing that had escaped the cellar crept closer. And then, just before the lights went out, I realized there was never supposed to be a 13th step. It started around midnight on Friday the 13th. I had been lying in bed, scrolling through my phone when it rang, an unknown number. Normally I wouldn't have answered, but it was late, and part of me thought it might be important. "Hello?" I said, but there was only silence on the other end. I waited for a few seconds, figuring it was just a prank or a wrong number, but the longer I held the phone to my ear, the more unsettling it felt. I could hear something faint, breathing, slow, deliberate, and too close to the phone's speaker. I hung up, unnerved, but didn't think too much of it. Maybe someone was messing around, or maybe it was just a glitch. Either way, I decided to put my phone on silent and go to sleep. About 30 minutes later, it rang again, same unknown number. This time, I didn't answer. The screen glowed in the dark, and I watched it, waiting for the ringing to stop. It went to voicemail, but no message was left. I turned the phone off entirely, trying to shake the sense of unease creeping over me. By morning, I had convinced myself it was a coincidence. After all, people prank call others all the time, right? I went about my day as usual, pushing the incident to the back of my mind. But when the same number called me again that evening, I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something wasn't right. The next call came at 7 p.m., just as I was getting ready to eat dinner. The same unknown number flashed on my screen. My stomach twisted with unease. I considered ignoring it, but my curiosity got the better of me. I picked up the phone, half expecting silence again, but this time there was a voice. "Hello, Ava." The sound of my name made my heart skip a beat. I didn't recognize the voice. It was deep and distorted, like someone was speaking through a bad connection. "Who is this?" I demanded, but the voice didn't answer my question. Instead, it simply said, "I've been watching you." A chill ran down my spine. I instinctively glanced around my apartment, checking the windows, but everything was locked up. My heart raced as I tried to maintain control. "If this is some kind of joke, it's not funny," I snapped. The voice remained calm, almost amused. "You shouldn't have answered." That was it. The line went dead. My hands were shaking as I set the phone down on the table. How did they know my name? And what did they mean by watching? I tried calling the number back, but of course, it didn't go through. It was listed as unknown, impossible to trace. For the rest of the evening, I felt on edge, like someone was standing right behind me, just out of sight. The air in my apartment felt thick, oppressive. I turned on every light and checked every room, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. By 9 p.m., I was jumpy, every little noise making my heart race. I kept telling myself it was just someone trying to scare me, some creep who got my number and thought it would be funny to mess with me. But the way they said my name, it felt personal, too personal. I tried to calm myself by watching TV, distracting my mind from the gnawing sense of dread building inside me. Just as I started to relax, my phone rang again. I hesitated before picking it up, my hands trembling. The voice was back, more distorted than before, like it was coming from some distant place. "Ava, why didn't you lock the back door?" The voice was barely above a whisper, but the words sent a wave of terror through me. I froze, my eyes darting toward the back of the house. The back door. I hadn't even thought to check it earlier. I jumped up and ran to the kitchen, my heart pounding in my ears. The door was unlocked. My fingers fumbled as I twisted the deadbolt and slid the lock into place. The phone was still pressed against my ear, but I couldn't hear anything now, just silence. "Who are you?" I screamed into the phone, my voice shaking. The reply was chilling. "It's too late." The line went dead again. My hands shook so violently that I dropped the phone. I backed away from the door, staring at it like it was about to burst open. Whoever this was, they weren't just watching me. They were close, too close. I spent the next few hours pacing the house, my mind racing through every possible scenario. Who could be doing this? Was it someone I knew, or a stranger who had somehow gotten access to my life? I didn't feel safe in my own home anymore, but leaving felt just as dangerous. What if they were outside, waiting for me to run? Every creak of the house, every gust of wind made me jump. I kept thinking I could hear footsteps, soft but deliberate, outside my windows. Just after midnight, the phone rang again. I didn't want to answer, but I couldn't ignore it either. My hands were trembling as I pressed the phone to my ear. This time, the voice was lower, almost a growl. "I'm inside." I dropped the phone and grabbed the nearest weapon I could find, a kitchen knife. My breath was coming in short, panicked gasps as I backed into a corner of the room. The lights flickered, casting long shadows across the walls. I was shaking, heart pounding, trying to listen for any sound of movement. But there was nothing, just the oppressive silence, broken only by my ragged breathing. For the first time that night, I thought about calling the police, but what would I say? A few creepy phone calls? They wouldn't take me seriously. And yet, I knew something was horribly wrong. I couldn't just sit there and wait for whatever was coming. But every time I tried to move, fear paralyzed me. It was like the house itself was closing in, suffocating me with its silence. The only thing I knew for sure was that I wasn't alone anymore. I don't remember when I fell asleep, but when I woke up, the house was eerily quiet. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting pale light through the curtains. My phone was lying on the floor where I had dropped it the night before. For a moment, I wondered if it had all been some horrible dream, but then I saw the missed call notifications. The last call had come at 3 a.m., but this time there was a voicemail. I hesitated before pressing play. The voice was soft, almost a whisper. "You're safe for now, but next Friday the 13th, I'll be back." My stomach twisted, and I dropped the phone again. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The terror I felt wasn't just from the voice, but from the fact that whoever this was, whatever this was, they knew exactly how to get to me. They were playing a game, and this was only the beginning. I spent the rest of the day in a fog, trying to wrap my head around what had happened. There was no logical explanation, but I knew one thing. The caller wasn't finished with me. The next Friday the 13th loomed ahead like a ticking time bomb. I didn't know what would happen when the day arrived, but I knew that no matter where I was, no matter what I did, the phone would ring again. I moved out of that house 2 weeks later, but deep down, I knew it wouldn't matter. Whoever or whatever the caller was, they wouldn't stop. I haven't slept through a Friday the 13th since. It was the first Friday the 13th after I'd moved into my new place. I wasn't superstitious, never had been, but there was something about that day that felt off. It started when I noticed the black cat, I'd seen it that morning, sitting on my front porch, staring at me with bright yellow eyes. It was sleek, its fur shiny and dark as midnight, with a look that almost felt human. I figured it was just a stray and didn't think much of it. By the time I left for work, it was gone, and I didn't see it again until late that evening. I was pulling into the driveway when I saw it, sitting in the exact same spot as before, eyes locked on me. Its gaze was unsettling, like it was watching my every move. I tried shooing it away, but it didn't budge. It just sat there, unmoving, like it had claimed my porch as its territory. That night, strange things started happening. The lights flickered, the air inside the house felt colder than usual, and I kept hearing soft scratching sounds, as if something was brushing against the walls. I went outside to check, thinking the cat had gotten into the house somehow, but when I opened the door, there was nothing there, just the wind and darkness. But the cat was still watching, sitting in the same spot, its eyes glowing eerily in the dim light. I shut the door and locked it, telling myself it was just a weird coincidence. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. After that first encounter, the black cat became a regular visitor. Every Friday the 13th, without fail, it would appear on my porch, always in the same spot, always watching. I started to dread those days, the unease growing with each appearance. The first few times I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just some stray that had taken a liking to my house. But it never approached, never meowed or acted like a typical cat. It just observed. By the third Friday the 13th, I couldn't ignore the strange occurrences any longer. The flickering lights had become more frequent, happening almost every night, but they were worst on those cursed Fridays. There were other things too, small objects going missing, only to reappear in odd places. Doors creaking open when I knew I had shut them, that constant scratching sound that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Each time I looked outside, the cat was there, staring. One evening, as I sat at my kitchen table, I heard a loud crash from the living room. Rushing in, I found one of my framed photos, an old family picture, lying face down on the floor. The glass was shattered. I could have sworn I'd hung it securely earlier that day. That's when I saw it. Outside, illuminated by the streetlight, was the cat, its glowing eyes fixed on me through the window. Something about it felt deliberate, like the cat had caused the photo to fall. The idea was ridiculous, I knew that, but the growing sense of dread was impossible to ignore. It was as if the cat's presence was influencing the house, twisting it into something dark and malevolent. I started asking around about the house, trying to get some answers. Maybe there was something about the place that explained the strange occurrences. After a bit of digging, I found out that the previous owner, Mrs. Donovan, had died under mysterious circumstances. The locals didn't like to talk about it, but they said she'd been found dead in the house on a Friday the 13th. Her body had been discovered at the bottom of the stairs, and though the official report ruled it an accident, people whispered about something more sinister. Mrs. Donovan had lived alone for years, except for her cat, a black one, just like the one that kept showing up on my porch. Some said she'd been obsessed with the cat, treating it like her child, while others claimed it wasn't a normal animal at all. One neighbor, an old woman with a sharp tongue, told me flat out, "That cat's cursed. You do well to stay away from it." I didn't believe her, but the more I thought about it, the harder it became to dismiss the idea. Every Friday the 13th, the cat returned, and every time, the strange happenings in the house intensified. I began to wonder if it was the same cat that had belonged to Mrs. Donovan, or if it was something else entirely, something darker. That night, I dreamed of the cat. In the dream, it was sitting on my chest, its weight pressing down on me, making it impossible to breathe. Its eyes burned with an unnatural fire, and it whispered in a voice I didn't recognize, "You're next." I woke up gasping, drenched in sweat, and for the first time I was truly afraid. By the time the next Friday the 13th came around, I was a nervous wreck. The cat hadn't shown up in weeks, and part of me had hoped it had finally moved on. But deep down, I knew better. That morning, as I stepped outside to grab the newspaper, there it was, sitting on the porch like it had never left. Its yellow eyes gleamed in the early morning light, and a cold sense of dread washed over me. The entire day felt wrong. Everywhere I went, I felt like I was being watched. The lights in the house flickered constantly, casting eerie shadows that seemed to move on their own. The scratching sounds were louder now, more frantic, and they seemed to follow me from room to room. At one point, I swore I saw a shadow dart across the hallway, something small and fast, but when I checked, there was nothing there. That night, things escalated. I was sitting in the living room when I heard a loud thud from upstairs, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. I froze, heart pounding. I lived alone. Slowly, I grabbed a flashlight and crept up the stairs, my pulse racing with each step. When I reached the top, I saw the door to the attic, the one I never used, swinging open. I didn't want to go in, but something compelled me to. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing dust-covered boxes and old furniture. And then, in the far corner of the attic, I saw it, the black cat, sitting perfectly still, watching me. My breath caught in my throat. I hadn't let it inside. I knew I hadn't, and yet here it was. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. The cat didn't move, didn't blink. It just sat there, its eyes glowing in the dark attic as if it had been waiting for me. I felt trapped, the air in the room growing thick and suffocating. I couldn't breathe. The walls seemed to close in around me, and the floor creaked under the weight of something unseen. I turned to leave, but as I did, I heard a voice. It wasn't loud, barely a whisper, but it was there. "She never left," it said. The voice wasn't human. It was cold, hollow, like the wind speaking through cracks in the wall. I spun around, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The cat was gone. In its place stood a shadow, tall and thin, its form barely visible in the dim light. The room grew colder, the temperature plummeting until I could see my breath in the air. The shadow moved toward me, slow and deliberate, as the voice whispered again, "You're next." I ran, tripping over the boxes and old furniture, stumbling down the stairs as fast as I could. I didn't stop until I was outside, gasping for air, my heart racing. The house was silent now, but I knew what I had seen. Mrs. Donovan's cat wasn't just a pet. It was a harbinger, a warning of something much darker. I moved out the next day, but it didn't matter. Every Friday the 13th, no matter where I go, I see the cat, always watching, always waiting. And I know one day I won't be able to run from it anymore.